We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Dr. Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Republicans introduced a bill naming China as a top threat. Yesterday, Republicans introduced a bill in the House declaring China the top economic and national security threat to the U.S. The legislation, dubbed the China Task Force Act, was authored by House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, and co-sponsored by Representative Michael McCall from Texas. They keep trying to swat the hornet's nest, and I think eventually they're going to get stung. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He's a frequent collaborator with all major news outlets and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure. As always, glad to be here.
Before we get to talking about China, would like to get your take on the latest results of the election in Bolivia. As we were just talking with Garland, Garland made the point that the reporting now is Bolivia has shifted back left as though, based upon a coup, somehow that's a willing shift to the right. Caleb Maupin, give us your take first on what happened with the latest developments in Bolivia before we move on to talk about China.
Right. Well, in Bolivia, the Socialist Party, the movement towards socialism, was reelected. Now, they were forced out of power. Evo Morales, he declared himself the winner of the previous election, and the polls showed that he was the winner of that election fair and square. The Organization of American States had noticed some irregularities, but they were not enough to have affected the outcome. But regardless, classic color revolution. The media was, cheering a small group of very wealthy protesters out in the streets. The military moved in, and Evo Morales was forced out of power last year. Well, now they finally had another election, and the party of Evo Morales is back in power. They won the election, and according to all reports, it was a fair election. They won it. They won it fair and square. The right-wing, quote-unquote, interim president, the woman who was, took power after the coup, has recognized it was a legitimate election. It was a blowout. I mean, 52% went to the movement towards socialism party, and it was a blowout. And this is because the movement towards socialism has a huge amount of support in communities, in a lot of neighborhoods. There are associations and community assemblies that back them. There's the labor movement. There are a lot of indigenous religious groups that back them. There's also a lot of ministers and pastors and priests who support them. And all through Bolivia, there is a very, very well-organized movement of working-class people that support the movement towards socialism party. And they went to the polls and voted against them. Now, many of the people that are on the scene in Bolivia say that what's particularly shocking is that the media in Bolivia seems to be almost united against the movement towards socialism. If you turn on the TV or the radio in Bolivia, you are going to hear nothing but hate for the movement towards socialism party. That did not stop 52% of the people who voted from going out and voting for the party of Evo Morales. So that's huge. Now, the current leader, the president-elect, says that Evo Morales will not have a new role, will not have a role in the new government. Now, Evo Morales will be the leader of the movement towards socialism party, but at this point, they have said they do not intend to appoint him to a cabinet position or the Supreme Court or anything like that. That he will be the leader of their party, but he will not have a role in the government. What is also particularly interesting about this is that we've seen right-wing rioting in many of the areas that were a stronghold of opposition to Evo Morales and now to the movement towards socialism. There has been a lot of there's been some clashes. There's been some violence. The police have gone out. There's been buildings lit on fire and such, and that's getting very little coverage in Western media. But there has been in the last couple of days a spat of right-wing violence in response to Sunday's results. So it appears that a party that was more sympathetic to Russia and China, that favored moving Bolivia toward a more state-run, centrally planned economy to eradicate poverty, that government will be back into power, it seems.
Moving on to China, we've got some legislation that says recently a number of GOP lawmakers have introduced a bill that declares China the top economic and national security threat to the U.S. It's going to have a bunch of legislative recommendations made by the China Task Force. And it seems that, this is something that, as we know, in all likelihood will be bipartisan. and it will, it will once again push the U.S. government and military in the direction of aggression and confrontation against China. And it particularly says what they always use these terms, the Chinese Communist Party. What are your thoughts about this legislation, Caleb?
Well, as is observed by almost everyone, China's economy at this point is grinding ahead. I mean, it is moving ahead. The IMF is predicting a very large growth rate at this point. They have handled the pandemic and they've moved on. And what many people don't seem to get is that the Chinese economy is very much set up to handle things like a global pandemic, or economic meltdowns and such. In 2015, the Chinese stock market crashed. I mean, it just dropped really, really dramatically and really, really quickly. And observers around the world saw this happen, and they said, wow, this is the end of the Chinese economy. Well, the next week, the stock market was right up, where it had been right before the crash. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party just stepped in. They banned short selling, so no one could bet against stocks going up, bet for stocks to go down. They, threatened anyone on threat of arrest if they were, doing that short selling. Furthermore, all the state-run industries froze their stock selling shares. And at that point, the economy of China just bounced right back. And if you look at the details, the Chinese stock market, very, very few in the population are in any way tied to it. It's roughly like 10% of the population has any relationship with the stock market. The Chinese economy is centered around the state. It is centered around the government, state-run industries, state-run banks, state central planners, and even the private sector. At any point, the Chinese Communist Party can show up and say, you must do this, and they have to do it. And because of that, the Chinese economy is moving ahead, and it is built to withstand, things like a global pandemic, which throw the economy into chaos, right? Now, our economy, on the other hand, is not set up that way. It is not centrally planned. There is, every different interest group is doing whatever they want, and the state, tries not to intervene. And if it does, it's being pushed in different directions about how it should intervene. You'll recall Donald Trump at the beginning of this pandemic couldn't even bring himself to wear a mask. He couldn't tell his followers to wear a mask. There were those protests where the people went out into the streets demanding that, the Trump supporters and the Tea Party folks were out there saying, we gotta open up. We gotta open up. I need a haircut. And there was so much disagreement and so much inconsistency that our response to the pandemic has, prolonged the pandemic, created a widespread economic crisis in the country. Whereas China, they locked down, they handled the pandemic, and they moved ahead. So at this point, China is emerging as a very, very strong competitor with American corporations, whether it's Huawei Technologies, that is at this point the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, making phones that are far higher quality than Apple, but at the same time, charging a lower price for them. Whether it's, the Chinese steel manufacturing, China makes half the steel in the world. Whether it's Chinese copper manufacturing, they make well over half of the world's copper. Many successful business operations are coming out of China. It's interesting that they always make a point of pointing out the Chinese Communist Party, because what's interesting is they can't seem to make up their mind. Whenever you point to China's great economic achievements, right-wingers will inform you, well, that's because they're capitalist, right? That's because they had market reforms. That's because they stopped being socialist. But now, if you ever hear anything in the news about China, you hear about how they are communists. Mike Pompeo says they are a Marxist-Leninist state. So they can't make up their mind. Is China a hardline communist menace, or are they a free market country proving that if you adopt the free market, everything will move ahead? Well, the reality is that China does not have a free market system. It doesn't have a Soviet-style command economy. Everything isn't run by the state. There's a big market sector. But at the end of the day, that market sector is not free to do whatever it wants. The state centrally plans the economy. They have a 5-year economic plan. The last 5-year economic plan they put out, they actually made a very cute video with a kind of a song explaining what the 5-year economic plan was for children. It was very cute. It was kind of a cartoon and video explaining how their 5-year economic plan works. But it's a centrally planned economy with a big market sector. Vietnam has a very similar economic setup. They call it a socialist-oriented market economy. And the idea is that, yes, you can have markets, you can have private businesses and such, but you need a state that controls all of it and works on behalf of the population to make sure that the economy is working in the interest of society. And that this is a less rigid application of Marxism. But at the end of the day, Marxism, called for the workers to control the means of production, or society as a whole to take control of the economy and force the economy to work in the interest of all, so that growth is not any more limited, and to eradicate poverty and raise people up out of poverty with planning and growth. And China is doing that, and they have done it in a much more effective way than the Soviet Union did in its final years. So, I think that China is a socialist society, and that they have modernized and updated socialism to make it more effective. Their economy is moving ahead, and so our leaders see them as a threat.
You just posed the question, is it a market-driven economy? Is it a state-controlled economy? KJ No said on the show maybe Monday or Friday, it's neither. It's China, and it needs to be understood as such. And no, China doesn't have the Adam Smith invisible hand theory. China has the government hand theory, and it seems to be working for China quite well. And, there's I think it was Monday, there were 6 cases of COVID discovered in the metropolis of Qingdao. And based upon 6 cases of COVID being discovered, China is set to conduct a mass screening campaign of 9 million people in a metropolis of 9 million people. You have an outbreak of COVID. How many people came out of the White House? Like 13 people came out of the White House a couple weeks ago with the president, and the United States can't contact trace those people. Folks need to stop looking at these differences and start understanding these realities. If someone's whipping your behind, they're whipping your behind for a reason, and it's probably because you can't fight. Caleb Maupin.
Certainly. There are many things about China that are worth learning from. But I think one key difference is that, China, in order to stimulate their economy, when there are bumps in the road, they have decided how they're going to deal with those bumps in the road. And in the United States, we have also had bumps in the road economically, and we've figured out how to deal with it. But we've kind of determined that the way to stabilize our economy is with lots of government spending on the military and lots of government spending on prisons. And we seem to not be very excited about scientific research. We seem to not be very, very excited about industry and infrastructure. We seem to be quite excited, when it's time for the government to spend money, let's have them build big giant prisons, let's have them build lots of tanks and bombs and planes. And we have made the decision as a society to stabilize our economy with methods of destruction. Whereas China, there's a huge amount of government investment into research and development, into scientific endeavors. The university system has been built up. Infrastructure has been built all over the country. They're leading the world when it comes to high-speed railway and trains. They have a space program that is really cutting edge. They just, before the pandemic, they had that very, very exciting mission to the far side of the moon. That China has made the decision that when the state takes action to stabilize the economy, they're going to do so in ways that are, forward-looking and productive, not in ways that are means of destruction. And I think that is something you can put aside the conversation about socialism and capitalism and Marxism, put all of that aside and just say, okay, when there's a bump in the road, how do we deal with it? Do we blow things up or do we build things? Well, China's made the decision to build things, and I think that's something we can learn from them as a country.
Caleb Maupin, as always, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
Folks, you are listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.